Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to start by introducing myself and my colleagues to you all. My name is Dr. Inga Dornan and I'm based in politics and history. I'm a historian. My research is focused on slavery and the slave trade. And I teach a first year module on the history of race, Britain and empire, and a final year module on slavery and abolition. I'm also the new incoming head of politics and history as of September as well. I'm just going to turn now to my colleagues and ask them to introduce themselves. Alison, would you like to say hi?
Hello everyone, it's wonderful to meet you. My name is Dr. Alison Carroll. I'm a senior lecturer in European history and I teach modules at first year on 20th century European history. I also contribute to the military history programme with the module on Europe at War, and then I teach a third year module which is focused on borders and ideas about national belonging in modern Europe.
Thanks very much, Alison. Stephen?
Hi there, I'm Dr. Stephen Wagner. My research focuses on British intelligence and empire and the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I teach the Arab-Israeli conflict in year 3, and I also teach a module on conflict and diplomacy for first years. I also contribute to our MA program in intelligence and security studies. And I look forward to meeting you all very soon.
Thanks, Stephen. Hannah?
Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Hannah Whitaker. I'm a senior lecturer in African history. My research is mainly about the history of colonialism and decolonisation in Africa. I teach at level 1, so in the first year I teach a module called Africa and the World. In the second year I teach a module called Colonialism and Decolonisation in Africa. And in the third year I teach a module about violence and conflict in modern Eastern Africa.
Thanks very much, everybody. Welcome to you all, as today we try to give you a bit of a sense of some of the topics and themes that we explore in the Modern History programme at Brunel. And there'll also be an opportunity for you as well to ask us some questions at the end if you have any about the degree programme itself. So one of the core elements of our modern history programme is to explore issues about race and identity and belonging, communities, society, how societies and communities have developed over time, and the ways in which, most importantly as well, the past is not dead, but has its legacies in the present as well. I'm just going to turn here to my first slide, if I can do. And so some of these images I hope will be very familiar to you. You'll all, I'm sure, recollect that on the 25th of May, this year, we learned globally, we learned of the tragic murder of George Floyd, and this really galvanized what had previously also existed, but galvanized the Black Lives Matter movement and galvanized it in a way that it became a real global movement as well. And very shortly after the 25th of May, on the 7th of June, you might also recollect as well that Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol led to the toppling of the slaver and philanthropist Edward Colston, who you can see there being tossed into Bristol Harbour. And what that did was to trigger across the world, in many different parts of the world, the toppling of monuments, memorials and statues to slavers and imperialists, as much in Britain as in other places in the US, for example, and in Europe as well. And also inspired wider conversations in the media, most particularly about whether statues to slavers and imperialists should remain on public display in public places, and the ways in which those statues any longer legitimately represent, for example, in Britain, British history. So this is one of the questions that I want us to consider today, the ways in which British history is publicly represented in Britain. And I thought one of the ways we might try to do this is by thinking about the places where we ourselves live, and think about the statues and memorials and monuments that we're familiar with and what kind of stories they tell. So I'll give everybody a second to think about this, to think about where you live and the memorials and the representations that you see. That could also include street names and the names of buildings as well. And think about what kind of past is being summoned by those names or by those images. I can give you one example of where I live. I live in the heart of Oxfordshire here, in a very small village, a very typical kind of, thatched roof village. And some of the houses are, for a village in Oxfordshire, very oddly named. For example, Jamaica Cottage. And actually, if you dig back into the history of the village, then you learn that the village was once owned, and in many places still is owned, by the Gibbs family. And the Gibbs family have connections, you won't be surprised to learn, to the West Indies. And the nature of those connections, again, you won't probably be surprised to learn, is slavery. And that's represented still today in the names of the buildings and the cottages, and some of the street names around the village as well. So does anybody else want to chip in? Use the Q&A by all means, or speak up, unmute yourself and speak up by perhaps sharing one or two examples in your local area of the ways in which the past is represented.
Hello. In my area in London, we only really have war memorials for the First World War and the Second World War. We don't have anything else. And because most of this part of London was developed in the interwar period, it doesn't have the kind of deep-rooted history that Oxfordshire might have. So I don't, to my knowledge, can't think of any street names or anything like that that have links to the British Empire. But like I said, the only memorials we have here, the statues or ways of representing history, are like I said, war memorials. What's most powerful about them, I think, is that on the local one, the one nearest to me and the second nearest to me, they list the names of the people who lived in the village, because it used to be a village back then. They list the names of the people who lived in the village who fell on the First World War and in the Second World War. And one of the things that's most poignant is if you look at the names that are on the left for the First World War, you might find one kind of James Smith there, or two or three James Smith. If you look at the Second World War, you'll see the surname repeated again. So there's definitely a kind of emotional connection you feel with the street that you are on, knowing that there were people there 100 years ago, or fewer than 100 years ago, who were killed in a war in a foreign country. But apart from that, there isn't anything here. But I wonder if, if other people think, or if other people live in areas that are slightly older than this one, where there may be more statues or things like that.
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? If we think about what's the prominent features of villages, towns and cities throughout the United Kingdom, war memorials, memorials to those who fell in the First and Second World War are possibly the most prominent. If you were to make a bet on what kind of public representations exist up and down the land, then that's going to be, I think, the primary one. And so what's being remembered then in British history is the centrality and the impact of World War I and World War II. It's a very 20th century history that's being represented there. And as you point out, it's the local fallen as well. There's the local story there, and there's the global story as well that's being told. And I think, there's been lots of debates much more recently about the lack of diversity and inclusivity in war memorials. Most war memorials across Britain are to the fallen who were male soldiers, and who were predominantly white as well. And there's an increasing debate about the ways in which, for example, women contributed to World War I and World War II, most particularly on the home front, but also in various capacities abroad as well, and how that hasn't been publicly represented as much as it could be. Does anybody else want to share another example of where they live and how the past might be represented there?
Yeah, I can share. So I live in Thetford, which used to be like the biggest capital of East Anglia back in like medieval times, I believe. And the two big statues that we have are of Thomas Paine, who was one of the founding fathers of America. And then we also have a statue of the last Maharaja, Dulip Singh. And out of them two, it's a very stark difference between them. So the Thomas Paine statue is in the middle of town, and it's bright gold, and it gets repainted every couple of years, and it's like very well respected in the town. But the Dulip Singh statue is on the outskirts of town in this little square, and it's a black marble statue, and not many people go there. And out of the two, that's the one that's most likely to be defaced. So I think with history in that sense, like my local townspeople, they don't really care for either of them. But if they did have to pick one, it would be Thomas Paine, because they know of it and it is the biggest statue that they know of, which I think is quite sad because they both did amazing things, especially for the area. And yeah, we do have Boudica as well. She was a local person. My high school was Iceni Academy, so we do have ties with her as well. But yeah, very vast in that history. Yeah,
that's really fantastic. What richness actually you have in Thetford there. I think you raise a really interesting point as well about the ways in which it's not simply or only even what statues, monuments and memorials represent, but actually how well people know who they represent. I think this was one of the issues about Edward Colston. I think Edward Colston probably became the most famous slaver in the United Kingdom, most well known by the end of June. But I think you can safely bet before then, only a handful of Bristolians would have known who Edward Colston was, and certainly not all Bristolians as well at that. And there is that sense, isn't it, where you walk past statues and memorials. Do you know who these people are? There was this wonderful debate in the 1800s in Parliament where the call was to tear down statues. This idea of tearing down statues is absolutely nothing new. And the reason for tearing down the statues was that parliamentarians were saying that they're really expensive to maintain, and we have no idea who these people are. So, even history itself had erased the history of some of the statues that had been erected, and they would say, oh, this must be some Roman soldier. And does anybody know who this is? And the parliamentarians would be shuffling their seats, and somebody would say, well, just take it down. No one's going to know. So I think it's really important, the significance and meaning of a statue so much is contingent on people knowing who that statue is of. And I think, that's where some of the sense of the importance of history comes to the fore here, of knowing who these public representations are. And so I guess I move then to my second question here. Should we keep statues of British slavers and imperialists on display in public places? Is it right that they should be torn down or removed? And as some critics have argued, to do so is to erase history or to rewrite history. Equally, there are those who would argue that actually keeping the statues is a way of being able to re-educate people about the past and about the contributions of men such as Edward Colston to British history. And then there are those who argue by maintaining the statues and not adequately recognising the dark shadows that really should or are cast over them, erases the victims such as Colston's victims in the transatlantic slave trade, and that we should have a public spaces which more adequately represent the diversity of British history. So I wonder if anybody wants to share their thoughts on that at all. Should we keep statues or should they go? Yeah.
I know from the Soviet and East European experience that, of course, they had an imperial history, but a very different kind with the Soviet Union in Ukraine and Poland and in that region. After the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine was very active in removing all of the statues that they had of Stalin. But if you say to a Ukrainian there, by taking down the statue, you're forgetting your history. I don't think there's a single person in Ukraine who doesn't know who Stalin is, and I think the same goes for Poland. To their mind, and this was, I think, definitely the intention of the Soviet Communist Party, the Russian Communist Party, the statues that they put up of Stalin and also of Lenin, but I think more were done of Stalin, were a direct attempt to glorify him and to glorify this regime. So I think if you look at it from this perspective, the glorification of what is imperialism, by removing his statue, I don't think you necessarily are erasing the history. But I do think that the point that that there might not be an alternative way of understanding it is valid. But of course, Soviet history is very prominent in Ukrainian and Polish and that region's education system. Maybe some of the people here who are against it feel as if it's not, British history or British imperial history is not as prominent in our education system as it should be. So I think that's one perspective of looking at it.
I think that's a really excellent point. I think you raised so many excellent points there, and I imagine again, German students would likewise say that we don't need statues of Hitler in order to understand Germany's past, and likewise we have in pupils at schools up and down the country in Britain have also been able to study Nazi Germany without having statues of Hitler erected up and down the country as well. So I think your point is extremely well made. Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to move on swiftly now to my colleague Alison, who's going to take us on to the next stage of our discussion today.
Thank you. And so we're sticking with how this has worked in the past and the types of controversies that have erupted over statues and whether we should keep them or whether we should pull them down. And actually, it's very neat that we finished that last segment by thinking about Germany, because this is where I wanted to pick up. And I wanted to pick up in the moment at the end of the First World War in November 1918, when French troops moved through Alsace-Lorraine, which had been annexed into Germany in 1871, and the return of Alsace-Lorraine had been one of France's major war aims. Now, before the French troops arrived in some of the major cities, the population of Alsace had already, rumours had started to spread amongst them that they were going to be returned to France. If you read diaries from the time, people say that the fact that wine prices have gone up suggests that they're going to be French again very soon. And as part of this coming to be French citizens rather than Germans, the population of Alsatian towns and cities turned on statues. And that's what the image is that you can see there in front of you. So while the images that Inga showed you will be things that you are familiar with, these are probably less familiar. I don't know if anyone wants to take a guess at what these statues depict. What do you think they show? Would anybody like to have a guess? And I don't expect you to know the exact answer. So they're depicting, as you can see, they're three figures who have all lost their heads. So it's postcards from November 1918. The three headless figures are three of the German imperial family. So 3 of the Kaisers. It's Wilhelm I, it's Wilhelm II, and it's Friedrich III. And the image that you can see beside the bodies is the decapitated head of one of the Kaisers, and these were produced as postcards to commemorate this moment. So very much like the images that Inga showed you of Colston being pulled down, a massive postcard industry arose depicting this moment of destruction of the past. So we talked about lots of things in that last segment about statues and what they tell us about where we are. These images make us think about how this has worked at moments in the past, so moments of regime change, moments when people were trying to create a new society or attempting to do so. If you think about what might have been happening in that moment in November 1918, why do you think the figures of the German imperial family, figures of Kaisers, would be the target of the population of Alsatian towns who were trying to tear statues down? What do you think these figures represented? I'll open that up to everyone.
I think that in the 19th century, at least, there was, from my impression at least, there was an idea, at least with European monarchies, that the people had a personal relationship with the monarch and with the sovereign, and you'd be very invested in the lives of the sovereign, and you'd feel that, you know, their strength meant national strength and their happiness meant national happiness and so on. But also that the primary figure of ridicule would always be, to someone you didn't like, I think would always be the enemy monarchy. So I think when I looked at political cartoons from the period, if something happened bad in Germany, or if some magazine didn't like Germany, they'd always portray the Kaiser in a negative way. And if there was a German newspaper that was attacking Britain, they'd always portray Queen Victoria in a negative way, and things like that. So I think that perhaps it was the case that, but perhaps this is an extension of that, the idea that the sovereign or the monarchy or the king is synonymous with the nation. So if you want to attack the nation, as it were, then the thing you attack physically is the statue. But I'm not sure, what others think.
That's how I would interpret it, and very, very much so. So it raises the question of why these statues were put up. And in this case, these statues were erected in Strasbourg after Alsace-Lorraine became German, as a way of trying to create a sense of shared Germanness amongst the population. So the royal family was as a figurehead that everyone had loyalty to, and a way of making people try to feel German. I mean, we can ask ourselves how far statues make you feel a sense of belonging, and that's something that might come up later on in our discussion, but that was their intention. And so because they've been put up with the intention of making people feel a certain way, pulling them down was intended very much to be a symbol of the fact that people no longer felt this sense of loyalty to Kaiser Wilhelm, to the German royal family, and then by extension to Germany and to the nation of Germany. And so this raises the question that I've got at the top of my slide about who makes decisions about which past it is that we commemorate. And the reason that I've put that up is because it was the population of Alsace-Lorraine who tore these statues down, but then it left empty spaces that used to have statues in them, and the French government came in and proposed a whole set of different figures associated with the French national past to go in their place. And if you read some of the documents from this period, lots of Alsatians weren't very happy about the French trying to do this. There was one meeting of the town council of Strasbourg where one of the councillors said if they need to keep doing this in the future, they need to make sure that all of the statues have got removable heads, because then the next time we change regime, the statues of the Kaisers on the post office could have just been replaced with the French generals who liberated us. It could just be Foch. Joffre and Pétain, who are there instead of the three Kaisers. And so this raises a question about who it is who's making these decisions and who should be making these decisions. Because if the past and the past that we choose to commemorate is telling us something about who we are, then this raises the question of who is the we and who do we want to be? So I'm going to leave that question hanging in the air at that point and hand over to my colleague Hannah Whitaker, who's going to help us to try and interrogate who we are and how we come to understand who we are.
I'm just going to jump in before Hannah starts to welcome a couple of welcome some late attendees, and just to let you know that if you want to respond to some of the questions that we're posing here and join in, you can either request to unmute yourself, or you can just answer in the Q&A. You can pose questions in the Q&A box, which is just at the very bottom bar of the screen. You can type in your question, you can send it anonymously if you like. There's a little tick box there, and we'll either respond to you live, which is we'll just answer you, or we'll answer you via the Q&A. So do feel welcome, please, everybody, to join in. And back to Hannah now.
Hi, yes, and welcome. Yeah, I just want to pick up on some of the things that Alison's been saying about who gets to commemorate the past and who decides which history is commemorated, because this really shapes how we think about ourselves and how we think about others. And I'm really interested in thinking about this question of what do we think about others? And I'm hoping to think about these issues in relation to aspects of African history. So these images that you can see are of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was an emperor in the Mali Empire in Western Africa in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Mansa Musa, you may or may not know, amassed a fortune built on trade in gold and in salt, which made him possibly the richest person or the wealthiest person to have ever lived. Mansa Musa was so wealthy, in fact, that when he went on the Hajj to Mecca in 1324, he went with an entourage of possibly 60,000 people and 21,000 kilograms of gold. He stopped in Cairo on his way to Mecca, and he's thought to have spent so much gold buying souvenirs, building mosques, and giving to the poor that he destabilized the entire regional economy of North Africa. Now, news of his wealth and his prodigal spending reached Europe very soon after this. And actually, this is a European source that we can see on our screens. This is an image of Mansa Musa from the 1375 Catalan Atlas. The Catalan Atlas is one of the most important medieval maps in Europe. And here we can see, it's depicting Mansa Musa with a huge nugget of gold. Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire do become something of legends in Europe and can explain in part why Europeans were so keen to begin exploring Western Africa in the 14th century. They wanted to get access to the Mali Empire and tap into its vast wealth. So I just want us to think a little bit about how this image of Mansa Musa and of Western Africa, of the Mali Empire, compares to images of Africa that we might normally see in the media or in popular culture. How does these images compare to representations of Africa that we are kind of more accustomed to? I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that. perhaps about how we normally see Africa depicted in the media, perhaps, or in popular culture more broadly.
Yeah, I can go. I like the idea of like the gold, especially with the golden nugget, and using that as a modern comparison, because I know in a lot of films and popular media there's a lot of gold or orange filter on a lot of places that aren't Western. So that's used on top of a lot of imagery, I think, in relation to Africa. And I think compared to this, that royalty and the golden nugget, I think that's still use of, I don't know, it's like othering in that sense. I'm not sure if that was what you were after, but I think there is a glimpse of that now, but here it's something something exotic and something to strive for, that the only area that, and he's a prominent focus of this atlas, that all you need to know about it is the gold, and that symbolism there. I don't.
Yeah, certainly. No, you're absolutely right that, you know, the images of Africa that we normally, or that we perhaps are used to, are often engaged in this process of othering, of and sometimes that might be a romantic othering. Often images of Africa might focus on sort of the landscape, on the wildlife, its kind of natural beauty, and perhaps its part of that natural beauty comes from its natural resources like gold. So yes, there is definitely a process, you know, there is definitely a process of othering in the media when we see images of Africa. I guess I was thinking, what are the prominent, or the most prominent kind of images that we do see of Africa in popular media? How are we used to engaging with Africa? How are we used to seeing it represented? Or another way of putting that question might be to say, are you surprised by the story of Mansa Musa and his wealth?
I think that's a really good point, Hannah, actually. I think most of us have you know, certainly my generation anyway, grew up and saw Africa as deeply poor as a continent, as powerless. And this is such a striking image of somebody who, as you're pointing out, was the wealthiest. We're not just, we're talking, Elon Musk kind of wealth and more for the time. Somebody who is incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful. This beautiful depiction, really exquisite depiction here of the political might and power of this particular individual. And that's not something, I think, one that we do see recognized within the media, but I don't think we see it recognized in our history books particularly either, or certainly perhaps in the history that many of us studied at school, where again the story is reinforced of Africa as a developing country, or as a third world country. That was the kind of typical depiction of Africa as this very, very backward, poverty-stricken country. As I was growing up, it was the 1985 Band-Aid and raising money for children, most particularly who were suffering incredible malnutrition. So I think this image is incredibly striking, and the story behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the image from the 1980s of famine in Ethiopia has really shaped the way we, and when I say we, perhaps I mean Europe and the West, thinks about Africa. Often times when we talk about, when Africa is spoken about in the media, it's also, you know, normally in relation to incidences of conflict, Africa, the war-torn continent. But I guess what I'm interested in is thinking about why that might be the case. You know, why, given this image of Mansa Musa and given the power and wealth that he represented, do we think about Africa normally in these ways as a place of famine, of poverty, of backwardsness, perhaps? I wonder if anyone had any thoughts about why we think about Africa in that way. Shamsha?
Is it perhaps sort of an overhang from not just the imperial era, but especially the 19th century and Darwin and the legacy that he left, even if he didn't do it on purpose, which was to say that essentially the lighter your skin, the more developed you were biologically, and that all of the so-called bad things, as it were, you know, the civil war and separatist nationalism and so on, were more present where you were less biologically developed, and that sort of went into, if you like, the European worldview, and has continued, well, European Western worldview, and has continued since that, which ultimately means that this image here of Mansa Musa and saying he was the richest person who ever lived is so shocking to us, because it's something that almost contradicts the worldview which is supposed to have been, or which pretty much has been ingrained in us for the past 200 or 300 years. The worldview being that Africa is an underdeveloped country, underdeveloped continent, and so on.
Yeah, I think you make some really, really important points, and I think, you know, the point you make about the way that Europeans in the 19th century were talking about Africa and the legacy that has had for how we talk about Africa today is really important, because there is a long history of Europeans thinking about Africa in this way as a place of poverty and backwardsness. And Europeans began to think and to talk about Africa in this way, in part because it helped them to justify things like the slave trade and things like colonial rule. And this history of slavery and colonialism has clouded both how we see Africa today, but also how we see its history. And this tells us also, though, about how we see ourselves in Europe. We see Europeans as the winners in these histories, the winners in the history of slave trade and colonialism. And it was certainly Europeans that benefited from these histories. And so therefore the tendency is to kind of assume that Europe is a place of wealth, of civilization, and to think about the history of Africa in terms of poverty, backwardsness, and in the words of European kind of 19th century explorers, as a place of darkness. But as you say, Mansa Musa, this image of Mansa Musa in this European source, questions what we think about the history of Africa and Europe. It questions what we think about the history of wealth and poverty. Today, you know, Europe is the place of wealth, Africa is the place of poverty. But this isn't how it's always been. In fact, at the time that Mansa Musa was living, Europe was actually being ravaged by civil wars, while Western Africa was flourishing. So given what we've just been talking about, the way that we think about ourselves and others, and how this is influenced by the past, even if what we think about others might not be objectively true, this leads us on to our final kind of question for this session, and I'll hand you over to my colleague Stephen Wagner.
Hi everybody. So I'm going to preface this discussion with something that might be obvious, should be obvious to you, is that I'm not from here. And therefore, my perspective on British imperial history is going to be really different from my colleagues and from yourselves, because I did not grow up being told how to feel about this island's history, its relationship with the rest of the world. Literally all we learn about England, by the way, is that's kind of part of Canada's origin story. They beat the French, and that's in their generosity, which is also like glossing over things, toward the French is why we have a kind of binational setup in our constitution. And that's it. So what I want to talk about is how we feel about these issues and how the kind of public discussion about Britain's history makes you feel, how you've been taught to feel about it, and also how you might want to rethink some of those things. So I put up two examples, mainly because I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about. I'm going to stick to the one on the left because it fits, I think, more closely with the themes we've been discussing so far. This is an image written long after the fact, drawn long after the fact of Britain's enforcement of the Blockade of Africa. So this is from the early 19th century. British Empire has abolished, made illegal the buying of people in Africa and transporting them to America for sale. That's abolition. And as part of that, the Royal Navy is enforcing the ban on this trade in the Atlantic Ocean. And this is one of the things, and the reason why I brought it up is when I teach the first year module on conflict and diplomacy, often what we're focusing on is the space between peace and war. And part of that is international law. And so what I've found is my students often will know something about the Blockade of Africa and will have been taught at some point to be proud of it. But you don't know the whole story, and which gives you some things, I think, that you might be inclined to feel good about, and some things that you might feel less great about. So, for example, the Blockade of Africa had multiple objectives. One of the reasons, of course, was like the force of the abolitionist movement, right? The kind of humanitarian mission of ending slavery. The other one, the reason why it was enforced so vigorously, was to prevent competition. This was about protecting the investments of British bankers and insurance companies and former slaveholders. Moreover, you may not know, the British slaveholders were compensated and to this day still receive compensation for their lost human property. On the other hand, and I'm not doing an A-level kind of balanced look at this, I'm keeping it in the abstract to tie up a discussion about how we're meant to feel about the past. But on the other hand, what Britain did in this period was actually remarkable in the way it shaped the way international diplomacy would work forever. So part of the enforcement of the blockade involved, if any other state wanted to sign a treaty with Britain, I've lost my image. You all still have it? Okay. It's just my computer. If any other state wanted to sign a treaty with Britain about any issue during this period in the early 19th century, they had to agree to join abolition and to enforce it. And this had a remarkable impact on the way, especially European states, but also emerging states in the Americas would, and namely the United States, would actually participate in banning the transatlantic slave trade and enforcing that ban. And this has an even greater knock-on effect in that this actually sets up the way the law would work and take shape. This is the beginning. You can draw a direct link from this moment in the early 19th century to the Hague Conventions at the end of the century, and how states get together to change the way the world works. So that's something I think has definitely changed the world for the better, but it's obviously come on the back of something horrible. Not only that, I mean, the international law itself, in the European sense anyway, took shape as basically European companies engaging in piracy in the Indian Ocean and legitimizing it in their own courts in Europe, like basically breaking Portuguese trade monopolies and that sort of thing. So there's not a really clear way, from my point of view, of how you're supposed to feel about this. And of course, abolition did not mean emancipation. And of course, there was still a very selfish motive in the way this was all set up. So now that I've said all that, I think I should just pose the question. I mean, how do you feel about the enforcement of the blockade of Africa? Is this something we have felt good about? Is this something we look back to our past and say, okay, we got it right this one time? Or how do we feel? How have you been taught to feel? Have you changed your mind?
I think in high school I was taught to feel as if every part of history comes with an ulterior motive, that everything that does happen has happened because of something else that was probably bad, and that's the way we should look at things, that there is always context to everything that happens. And with that, yeah, I think there is a complicated pride with our past. I personally am not very proud of this country and what we've done, especially with empire and slavery and stuff like that. And there's little to have been rectified modern times. To, I don't know if there's public apology. Can governments do that, or has there I don't know, been anything else? Yeah, to that standard. It makes me feel very complicated to how should I, stand up and sing the national anthem if they've done all this bad stuff, sort of thing. But then again, that's history, and if we apologise for everything we've done wrong, we'll be here for years. So it's very complicated. It makes me feel so sad about it, but at least it's an example that we can learn from and that we can take into one time stage, that on an international stage, working together does help things in that sense, by coming together and enforcing that, especially with the Hague Conventions and such. But yeah, it's very complicated.
Anyone else?
I think that I know everyone else, but when I was at school doing history, we weren't taught anything on really British imperial history, and this goes to the extent that I never learned about the Boer War in South Africa, the Second Boer War, and when I learned about it first, the university got very angry that the state had missed out this quite important event from my education at GCSE. Well, one of the things that, at least from my perspective, one of the reasons I think that the Boer War was not mentioned, and I suppose the blockade as well, is because it's too complicated to be fit into the framework of either this was a good thing or a bad thing. I remember quite clearly that the history we were taught, the British history, was a very clear narrative of First World War, then First World War, then female suffrage, then expansion of the franchise, and Second World War, and then that's it. But there isn't as much of a grey area, I don't think, a moral grey area with those events as there is with the blockade or with the Boer War or with any other part of British history, which I think cannot easily be fit into either this was a morally good thing or bad thing. But I do think that Britain's is not uniquely bad here, and I think every state in the world tries to have a national historical narrative that's quite clearly morally good always, regardless of whether the event was a positive or negative event. It's always morally good. I don't think any state likes to call itself the bad guy or even question whether they are bad or not.
That's really interesting. Both of those comments are really interesting, especially to me, where like I didn't go to school here and I don't know what it's like. But yeah, I guess the next question is, like, what's the point of judging the past this way? I mean, is this really a kind of, is history an accounting system where we kind of have in a like the credit column and the debt column, and like as long as we're in the black, we're a good country, and then we can feel good about? Is that what this is for? What's the point? Why does it seem like we're often being asked to do that? Unless you disagree with me that we're not being asked to do that. It feels to me like we're often asked to do that.
I remember last year or the year before when everyone was talking about Churchill when the Andrew Roberts book came out, and the debate was on the news panels. The debate was, oh yes, Churchill was bad and he did some bad things, but he also saved the country during the Second World War. And I agree with you. I think it's sort of it's a +1, -1, so it's okay. We don't have to worry. Or every time someone does something bad, you have to find something good that they've done, and it balances it out, and you don't have to worry. So I agree with you. Actually, I think that a large amount of the moral discussion of history we have is always, look at the good things they did and the bad things. So sort of we tally them up and then say they're more bad than good, and then make a judgment.
But what's the point of that? Why bother? Is history the place we ought to be looking to feel good about our country?
I think that what history does definitely do is is the ability to emotionally mobilize someone more than really anything else does, more than literature, more than art, more than anything else. If you're telling someone that you, as an individual, sit within a large historical narrative that might be 100 years long, it might be 10,000 years long, then you feel a kind of not just emotional attachment, but I do think that you feel a degree of mobilization there. But the attachment is so strong, and I suppose this goes to the Churchill point, is when you criticize, if someone has a deep personal connection to Churchill, and you as someone else criticizes it, it's almost as if you've criticized that person because the emotional attachment is so strong. You criticize, if you criticize Stalin in the 1950s or something in Russia, then people would take that as criticism of Russian people because the attachment was so strong.
That'd be a very risky thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to jump in there and interrupt this really fascinating conversation and bring proceedings for this particular seminar to a close as we initiate the next one, and ask all participants here to by all means hang on and join the next session that we're due to have, which I believe is politics based at least. But I also wanted to give a quick opportunity to anyone, if you have any questions that you would like us to answer about the program, about student experience, please by all means tap in a question in the Q&A box at the end of the screen, at the bottom section of the screen, and we shall do our best to answer before we hand over to politics colleagues to introduce their session. So does anybody have any questions that they would like us to answer? I shall give you a few minutes to perhaps think of a question and draft it if you want to. I should say that you can Google us all and find our details about what we teach and what we research on, and our email addresses, and would absolutely welcome emails from you if you think of further questions that you have or you'd like us to attempt to answer as well about the programme and the student experience as well. So I don't see that we have any questions yet, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Steve Pickering to launch the next seminar. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you all so much for your contribution. We had a really fascinating discussion, and I look forward to, we all look forward to welcoming you to Brunel to study modern history in September. So thank you very, very much. I'll let my colleagues say their goodbyes as well to you.
Goodbye, and thank you very much, everyone. I've really enjoyed this session. It's been fascinating, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone, and hopefully we'll see some of you very soon.
Thanks, everybody. See you in September.
Okay, thanks to our history colleagues there. Now we move seamlessly to our politics session. We have 4 politics colleagues on hand: Dr. Naveen Abdallah, Dr. Stuart Fox, myself, Dr. Manu Savani, and we've got 2 of our current students here as well, which is very exciting, and they should be able to better answer questions than any of us, because they're living through the experience in a way that we are not doing. The session, we've called it All Politics is Local, Even International Relations, and that's perhaps something we can look at. There are 4 politics degrees offered at Brunel. They are the BSc in Politics, the BSc in International Politics, the BSc in Politics and History, and the BSc in Politics and Sociology. Politics and history is, for those of you who've been in the history session already and are thinking, well, actually I'm interested in politics too, is a very good combination of the two, and is a very natural, cohesive degree that we offer, because we're both within the same building. Well, we are in normal times anyway. We're both, politics and history are both living in the same space, so we work together very well. I think one of the interesting things about politics as we do it at Brunel is you'll notice that all of those degree titles had BSc rather than BA. BA is the traditional way that politics is done, but we regard politics as a science, and there's 2 main reasons for doing that. First of all is that we genuinely believe that the old way of doing politics based on theory and nothing else is not very useful. The second is that actually we can give you transferable job skills that some other institutions are not equipped to do. By teaching you certain methods, we can give you things that you can use in the workplace. So if you stay in politics as a career, then these will be useful. If you leave politics and do something completely different as a career, these skills will also be useful. And if, imagine this, you decide that you don't want to leave academia, but you stay and carry on for a master's or a PhD or something, then these skills will also be very, very useful. So we do regard politics as a science, and we do believe that politics itself, even the international version, is fundamentally local. Now, one of the degrees we offer is called BSc International Politics, and it's not international relations. And this is something that students often ask me about. I'm the admissions tutor for the division, and there's some concern among some students that, oh, you don't offer an international relations degree. Well, actually, yes, we do, and we call it international politics, because international relations is a little too restrictive. International relations, like politics, the way it used to be taught, is that theory-driven idea, and there's not much beyond the theory, and honestly, the theories aren't very good. But we will teach them, because you wouldn't be able to talk with students at other universities unless we taught you what those theories are. So we will teach you international relations and more. So the BSc International Politics is like international relations plus the extra bit, the new stuff, the exciting stuff. Now, my colleagues are going to talk about their research today. I'm not going to bore you with mine. My research looks at war and peace and fish and chips, and you'd be surprised that you can use the same methods to look at all of those things. But I would like my colleagues to talk about their interesting research instead, and then if we have questions, then our student helpers can answer those better than any of us. So we'll start off our first bit, and I'll carry on with the slides. I'll introduce Dr. Manu Savani, who's going to start by talking about studying politics at Brunel. Manu.
Thank you, Steve. I'm a lecturer in public policy in the Division of Politics and History. And if we just go to the next slide, please. If you come to study politics at Brunel, that means you will be investigating power, governance, how we use institutions to organise ourselves, our communities and our society. And these are fundamental questions. These are really important for the way we can live our lives, the freedoms that we have and what we can go on to achieve. So something that we are really keen on is asking you to relate your learning in the classroom to real world events and policies and vice versa. So if there's something going on in the world around you that you are motivated by or angered by or inspired by, there might be something in one of the courses that we offer, in one of the modules that we offer, that helps you to go into that in more detail and analyse it from a different perspective. Something else that we like you to do is to bring your own ideas, bring your own arguments to class, discuss them with us, discuss them with your peers. So to give you an example of what this might look like in one of the modules I teach, I'm going to tell you a bit about a module called Social Welfare, Politics and Policy. So this is a module that really looks at the welfare state, particularly in the UK, but also across other European countries. So if you look at the image that's on the screen right now, that's a tweet. It's a tweet from Parliament, specifically the Petitions Committee. And they are publicising something that's been happening this week, which is a debate on child food poverty. Why did they schedule that debate? Because a petition was started last year and that's reached over 1 million signatures. It's gone beyond the threshold needed to trigger a parliamentary debate. But there's lots of things that are interesting here. So if something like this was going on, then maybe in class, we might talk about some of the following questions. So firstly, why are we talking about child food poverty in the UK, one of the wealthiest countries in the world? Well, we should look at the data. What does the data tell us that is happening to child food poverty in the UK at the moment? We might also want to look at this particular petition. How has it come to be on the political agenda? Well, you might see there on the tweet that the petition was started by Marcus Rashford, a footballer. So how is it and why is it that it took a celebrity to use his platform in order to put child food poverty and free school meals on the political agenda last year? What happened? What was the lead up to that? What does it tell us about the way decisions are being made and what's being prioritised? But we might also look at it from a policy point of view to understand if we can see that there's a problem and there's child food poverty and it's increasing, what are the solutions? And that's where we'd look at the evidence. What's working? Free school meals, how is that helping? But why is it not enough? And what else needs to be done? So that's the kind of discussion that we might have in class. I'm going to give you another example. And you can see from the image there, looks like a regular enough street. James Turner Street is actually based in Birmingham. But it was made very famous in a programme called Benefit Street that you may have heard about or even watched. It's one of lots of TV programmes that are on right now, which look at different aspects of living or relying on benefits, welfare support. So in one of the classes I ran last year, we actually looked at some of the reality TV like this, and we were looking at this question of how does the media portray welfare recipients? And if we analyse it, if we treat it like data and analyse that, what kind of tropes can we identify? Are there differences, changes, good things, bad things in the way that those portrayals are done? But we don't just care because we're interested in the media, we also care because we think maybe the media will influence the way public opinion evolves. What does the public think? And do they differentiate between some groups who are seen as more deserving of social support than other groups? So I'll show you another graph here, and this is actual data from a social attitude survey. And it's asking people if the government was to give extra money, wage top-ups for low-earning people, who should that support go to? And you can see that people really like the idea of that going to single parents, they're much less keen on it going to working couples without children. So that's telling us the public opinion does really differentiate between who they think deserves this kind of support and not. And why do we care about that? Well, we might care if it actually influences government policy and government decisions. So those are the kind of questions that we would talk about in a typical class. And if you're passionate about questions like that, problems like that, then you can also do your own research on it. So in your final year, students get a chance to run their own research projects and produce a dissertation. So there's been lots of really interesting ideas that are being discussed right now, in fact. So students have come to me with lots of plans for looking at how the welfare state works. Some of them did the social welfare module, so now they're looking at, how can I take some of that thinking and go a bit further with it on my own. Last year I had, or a few years ago rather, I had a student who did an excellent project looking at the Windrush scandal and how the media reported on it, because she was interested in immigration policy and dog whistle rhetoric in the media. So there's really a wide variety of topics, and it just depends on what you're interested in and what you want to go into more detail on. So before I hand over to my colleagues, I just wanted to say something about work and employability as well. Now, you may be thinking about what you might do after your degree. Chances are that that seems really far away. Maybe you've had a helpful uncle or a cousin say, what are you going to do with politics afterwards? Well, the answer is lots of things, pretty much anything, depends what you want to do. So to give you a couple of examples of what some of our recent students have done, one of my students is looking to do further study on law. And one of the reasons is that she did a placement with the solicitors while she was on her politics degree, and she realised that's what she wants to do next. Another student is putting in an application to do a teaching course, the Pgce. One of the ways that we help you to figure out what it is you want to do is through work placement opportunities. So this is where you get to spend a longer period of time, up to a year, working in an organisation. And sometimes that in itself might lead to a job offer at the end of your degree, but certainly will be excellent experience and help you figure out what you want to do. In the last year, we've had a student spend time at a High Commission in London, and she got to see what the life of a diplomat would be like, and it's something she's really keen to pursue now when she finishes her degree. Another student was based at NATO, and he found that a really fascinating place to be in the last year. So to help you with gaining work experience or securing a work placement, we have a professional development centre. These are people whose job is to help you with your CVs. They'll help you develop really good CVs, work on your LinkedIn profile, and essentially get you ready and prepared for those job applications and interviews. And you'll get one-to-one support from them. And also we have lots of careers talks and events and lots of opportunities to develop your skills in student societies on campus as well. So there's lots to help you figure out what you want to do next and how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. And now, next on our agenda here, if I can get the thing to work, we have Dr. Stuart Fox, who's going to ask the question of whether we should lower the voting age to 16. Stuart, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. As Steve has said, my name's Stuart Fox. I'm a lecturer in British politics at Brunel. And what I want to talk about in my few minutes is just one of the things that you will do if you come and study politics with us. On the courses that I'm involved with, obviously a lot of it is about British politics, but we also talk about things that are happening in America, in France, elsewhere in Europe. Anywhere that you're really interested in domestic politics, you will find something interesting in the numerous British politics courses that we offer throughout your entire degree programme. And one of the best things that I think we do is we study and debate, and sometimes we even argue about the really interesting issues that were responsible for getting many of us interested in studying politics or sociology or social science in general in the first place. And I'm going to give you an example of that through this question that's quite salient at the moment about whether or not we should lower the voting age to 16. We have the next slide, please, Steve. The really good thing about the kinds of issues that we talk about on our modules is that when you get to the really interesting questions, there aren't any right answers. It's always debates and arguments, and sometimes quite passionate arguments about what we think the right answer is, but there isn't a right answer. So we don't just stand at the front of the room and tell you what the right answers are or tell you a load of facts. What we will do, though, is teach you how to avoid the wrong answer. And as you probably guessed, there's plenty of those around, whatever issue it is you choose to talk about. So illustrating that with this votes at 16 point, I've taken this picture off the internet from a demonstration in favour of votes at 16 last year, where this girl has very helpfully summarised several of the wrong arguments for why we should lower the voting age, in my opinion, on her placard. She's drawn up a checklist for us in which she's implying that because 16 and 17-year-olds can join the armed forces, because they can have sex, because they can purchase alcohol, and because they work, they should also be allowed to vote. But none of them are particularly convincing, and in fact 3 of them are completely wrong. 16 and 17-year-olds can join the armed forces, but they don't serve on the front lines. That's prohibited by British law and international law. Can't purchase alcohol in Britain until the age of 18. That is a law that is very popular, and that at the moment there is nothing even approaching plurality of people who want to revoke it. They think that making children wait until they're 18 to purchase alcohol is entirely appropriate. We also have laws throughout the UK, actually, that if not mandating, strongly encourage, shall we say, 16 and 17-year-olds to be in some kind of full-time education, training, whether that's at university, college, or an apprenticeship, up to the age of 18. Now, the one point that isn't wrong with this girl's checklist is the point about sex. 16 and 17-year-olds can enter consensual sexual relationships, but so can chimps and many other members of the animal kingdom, and I'm not sure that we really want to connect the right to vote to the capacity and the legal right that we have to have sex. I think that they're very different issues, and trying to pretend that they're in any way similar sort of blurs the really important questions. So what we will be doing in our classes and seminars and so on, we won't be trying to ram the correct answer down your throat, but we will point out the wrong answers and give you information about why those are the wrong answers. And more importantly, we will be teaching you how to find evidence, how to find data, how to find theories and understand theories, so that you can work out your own arguments about these and that you can ask the right questions about these topics. Next slide, please, Steve. So you could quite reasonably wonder, if I came to you and said, should we lower the voting age to 16? Perhaps the correct response is not yes or no, or at least not immediately yes or no, but how should we decide whether to lower the voting age? I've just mocked the notion that the right to vote should be in any way connected to the legal right to have sex. You might disagree with me. That's fine. The majority of my students I am learning disagree with me when it comes to issues like this. But you at least have to have a good reason for disagreeing with me. You might want to consider what the consequences would be for young people's rights, as children or as adults, if we lowered the voting age, or whether it would affect their political representation in any meaningful or any substantial way. And we might also want to consider, when we're debating this, are there more important or more effective ways that we could change the electoral system, change the voting age, to improve young people's representation? And perhaps the best thing that we can do, and something that we definitely do on my courses, is look at what effect votes at 16 has already had, such as in Austria, Scotland, or Wales, where it was introduced for the elections that were held just a couple of weeks ago with, for those of you that are interested, probably already know this, the results in Wales were disappointing, to put it mildly. So those are the kinds of questions that we might encourage you to ask, and the questions that you might want to ask if I come to you and say, should we lower the voting age to 16? And this is what we'll be doing if you come and study politics with us at Brunel. If you do a politics degree, whether it's politics and history, politics and sociology, or just BSc politics, as Steve was mentioning before, then it's almost a certainty that you will be taught by me at some point, but you shouldn't let that put you off. The focus will be on these interesting questions, the issues that you are interested in and that got you interested in politics in the first place. And it won't be what's the right answer. It's going to be what do you think? Why? What evidence do you have of that view? And can you persuade me? And can you persuade others in your class that that's the right answer? And that's what we'll be teaching you to do and helping you to do. And it's not just votes at 16. It's questions like, why did the UK vote for Brexit? Why did Labour lose the 2019 election? Is Scotland going to become independent? Are young people less engaged with politics than their parents at the same age? And many more. And as Manu was saying just a few minutes ago, there are plenty of opportunities for you to choose your own topic, to choose your own question and tell us what you think. So I very much hope that I will see some of you in a few months' time and we can get stuck into some of these debates. And if you have any questions at all, I look forward to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Now, without any further ado, we will go forward on our next presentation, which is from Dr. Naveen Abdallah, who's going to talk about understanding conflict, mythic histories and chosen traumas. Naveen, take it away.
Hi, everybody. As Steve said, my name is Dr. Naveen Abdallah. I am a lecturer in international relations, defense, and security. In the first year, I teach a class called Conflict in the Modern World. And in that class, we learn about the root causes of conflict and the different ways that we can understand them. So today, I am going to give you guys a very quick tour of one aspect of conflict that I personally find very, very interesting, which is called Mythic Histories and Chosen Traumas. So we can understand how conflict occurs by looking closely at the stories we tell ourselves. And these mythic histories and chosen traumas will sometimes incite conflict, and they can even play a role in inspiring terrorism. So what are mythic histories? As I said, these are the stories we tell about ourselves. These are the stories we tell about our adversaries. And what these mythic histories do is that they convey culturally significant information, very important history that is relevant to a group, whether it's true or false. And leaders of these groups will sometimes use mythic histories in order to create a bond within a group or identify themselves by those histories. Excuse me. And we see this happening in two different ways. The first way that you can see are reparative leaders. And these are the leaders that try to unite a group without causing harm to another group. So you can see here we've got Martin Luther King Jr. You can also think of somebody like Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have destructive leaders. And those are leaders that try to create a victimization identity or maybe to vilify an enemy. And you can think of people like Adolf Hitler or Slobodan Milosevic or pretty much all of your terrorist leaders. Now, when they use these mythic histories, they tend to do it in three parts. You can see here on the next slide, sorry, Steve, there is a glorious past, a degraded present, and a utopian future. And so the story sounds something like, oh, we were once great, we were so fantastic, and then all of these things happened to us. It's not our fault, but they destroyed us. And if we fix this, if we find the solution, we will have a bright future. And so these stories work to do a bunch of different things. As I mentioned, they entrench the identity. They explain why the community fell from this glorious past to this degraded present. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes they offer a path to this utopian future. And what this does, if you can see the line at the bottom, is it creates this increase in emotional tension. And that emotional tension is designed to attract support and motivate action and inspire a desire to fix the group's suffering. If you could go to the next slide, please, Steve. So within mythic histories themselves, there's a component called chosen traumas. And a chosen trauma is when members of a certain group will transmit humiliating historical events or stories about those historical humiliating events across generational lines. And again, this reinforces that idea of large group identity, but what it also can do is create this sense of entitlement. In other words, the group kind of thinks they have the right to whatever it is they wish to have. So when a situation comes up that threatens the group's identity, the leader of the group will call on these chosen traumas to inspire action, and sometimes that action becomes violent, which leads us to conflict. And we see this in many, many conflicts, and again, we see this in many, many terrorist groups as well. Sometimes the leaders will discuss the glorious past and the degraded present, and they will not discuss the key to success for that utopian future. And when that happens, we have this rule here that the prescription is the inverse of the diagnosis. What does that even mean? So if a leader says a group is suffering because of the loss of a specific territory, there is an implied solution and an implied prescription. And that would be that we have to recover this land in order to restore our group's identity, in order to restore our national health. But sometimes leaders don't always say this outright. They might want to keep it quiet for a few reasons. Maybe they want to test what the domestic audience thinks or what the international audience will say or how they'll respond. They might want to subtly assess the potential for support of a violent movement, or it could even be a dog whistle for mobilizing extremists without alienating the more moderate members of the society. If you can go to the next slide, please. I just want to do a really quick example of how mythic histories can work. I took 3 lines out of a speech from Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, and he gave this speech at a place called the Fields of Blackbirds in Kosovo. And this site itself is very culturally significant because 600 years earlier, the Ottoman Empire defeated Serbia here. And it was a huge moment for the Serbs. And Milosevic himself became a very strong Serbian nationalist. And on this day, he addressed a crowd of 200,000 people. So in his speech, he speaks of the glorious past, when the Serbs fought for their own liberation and the liberation of others. And he speaks of the degraded present, which, he's blaming this degraded present on this lost battle 600 years ago, on the social superiority of the Ottomans, their military superiority, and also on this disunity that was going on in Serbia at the time, especially at the leadership ranks. Now, he does mention a little bit about how to get to the glorious future, this utopian future. And he says that Serbian unity is going to be the solution to overpower everybody. So you can see the 3 sort of stages of that narrative analysis, that mythic history and chosen trauma coming into play. Next slide, please. Now, to outsiders, the speech was pretty mundane. It didn't really spark anything, and it might have seemed pretty harmless. He's just calling for peace and brotherhood and unity. But context really does play a role here. As I said, Milosevic was an advocate for ethnic Serbs, and ethnic Serbs are largely Orthodox Christians in the area of Kosovo, and that area was predominantly controlled by Albanians and Muslims. So some argue that he was implicitly blaming Serbia's 6 centuries of suffering from that site on the Islamic population, or the population that converted to Islam to make their life easier during the battle with the Ottomans. And so he's implying, in a sense, that Muslims are traitors to the Serbian nation. So if we think of our rule, the prescription is the inverse of the diagnosis, then the speech can, by some, be understood to imply that Muslims deserve to pay for the suffering that was caused by the Serbs. So this seemingly innocent speech defined who was and who was not welcome into his Serbian nation, or his version of it, and also mobilized Serbian nationalists to fight for their country. And it might have mobilized some extremists and led to some increasing tensions between the Catholic population and the Muslim population. And ultimately, this became a factor in some of the increasing tensions that led to the wars that went on in the region during the 1990s. As you can see here, Milosevic was later indicted on charges of war crimes, including crimes of genocide. I think it was 66 crimes of genocide, and he died in prison in 2006. So next slide, please. Now, earlier I did mention that there are also reparative leaders. There's not just destructive leaders, because, there's the dark force and the light, if you watch Star Wars. And yeah. So some analysts have actually looked into this, and they argue that destructive leaders can only be successfully countered if an emergence of a reparative leader comes into play. So reparative leaders, what they'll do is they'll validate the human traumas and the chosen traumas and the mythic histories that exist, but they use those shared traumas to bring people closer together without harming anybody else. So instead of preaching vengeance, they're focusing on the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So the types of things that we'd be talking about in this class is, do you think that's true? Do you agree with that? Do reparative leaders have an opportunity to undo the damage that's done by a destructive leader? what types of chosen traumas can you think of that have occurred in the histories that you're familiar with, in the histories that you've studied over the course of your years, or maybe that you've even heard amongst your family or in a certain group? And as Stuart mentioned, there are no right or wrong answers. There's good arguments and better arguments, right? So these are the types of things that we'll be talking about in the class. And I really look forward to seeing you guys over the fall. Lost track of my talking. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Naveen. Okay, so that brings to an end the formal presentation section, and then puts us in the place where we can have a bit of a Q&A with our students, Jessica and Armin. So let me just stop sharing the screen here, and let's see. Do we have? I think right. Jessica and Armin, you are there. Are you able to? Is it letting you talk?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! Yes.
Thank
And Jessica?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. That's
fantastic. Yes, that's great. I wonder if either of you wanted to talk about the Brunel experience, how it was, what you expected, how it was what you did not expect, what university life is like.
University was quite different to what I expected. I know that it was more independent than I thought, but that's fine though, because I felt like the lecturers were still helpful and they were willing to help, even though like you're meant to do everything. Like most of it is meant to be on you. At first I was a bit scared because I didn't know what to expect, but you get used to it like pretty quickly. And I feel like first year is a chance for you just to get settled in and get used to like how uni works, because it's quite different to like A levels or whatever you do in sixth form.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I'd say oh sorry.
No, go Jessica. Go.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd say I'm enjoying my experience so far. First year was good as well. I studied politics and sociology, so I kind of have a mix of both. Second year was obviously a bit different with now like online teachings. But what I did enjoy at the beginning of like the academic year was having my physical seminars actually with Dr. Savani. That was really nice. It was a good opportunity to meet other students and stuff like that. But yeah, I would say first year is always good. It gets you settled and it was a good experience for me.
No, thank you for that. The point about independence is a really interesting one, because it is quite different to the way that you study previously at A level or at BTEC or on foundation courses or anything like that, where there is a very prescriptive way of doing teaching and learning, where the teachers tell you what you have to learn and you go away and learn it, and that's how it works. Whereas at university it is necessarily different. We do need our students to do independent research, to think for themselves, to develop what we call the critical thinking skills. And there's lots of reasons for that, and it does relate back to the point I made right at the start, which is the transferable skills. You'll find that employers who are employing graduates of degrees like politics, history, sociology, are looking for students who have developed those critical thinking skills, because they're able to solve problems, they're able to find trends, they're able to sift information in a way that people who don't have those degrees aren't quite able to do. So what our degrees are is they're not what you call a specialist degree. So it's not like doing a degree in accountancy, where there's a very good chance that if you do a degree in accountancy, you're going to become an accountant. You do a degree in politics, well, some people do become politicians, and our students have gone on to work at Westminster and or in polling agencies like YouGov. But there's a good chance that you won't. And it's because these are what we call generalist degrees, where they give you a set of skills that can be applied to a wide range of different disciplines and areas. So the independent thing is really important, and that is especially so in what Manu was referring to at the start, which is regarding the dissertations. We are especially keen at Brunel on starting the dissertation process as early as possible. Some other universities leave it rather later than we do, but we start the dissertation process in the second year, where we're getting students to think about what their topic is going to be, so that they've got all of the third year, and actually time before it, like the summer break, to start thinking about what that dissertation is going to be on. Because the key to a successful dissertation is having a good idea in the first place and making it something that's really interesting, something that you get up in the morning and think, I want to find this out, and I have the opportunity to do this. And it's a really fun thing to do. It's something that you might never get the chance to do in your life again. It's this one time at which you can say, this, I want to know this. We don't know this. This is a small thing. Maybe it's not the most important thing in the world, but maybe to you it is. I have that freedom to find it out. And it's our function as supervisors, as tutors, to not tell you what to do. And this relates to the points that Stuart was making. We're not telling you what to think. We're not telling you that you have to vote a particular way. We are telling you how to think. We are giving you the skills, the ability to research, to the critical skills, the ability to sift through data, so that you can become successful researchers, and ultimately you'll get good jobs from this. That's the aim of this. On that jobs topic, Brunel is quite unique in that across every degree program we offer the opportunity of doing a placement year, so that instead of doing the normal 3-year course, as is conventional in universities in England and Wales, that you can do your degree across 4 years, what we call a sandwich course, where you have a year in industry. And we do find that when students come back from that year in industry, they've learned some discipline, they are suddenly studying better, and the jobs that they're getting at the end of it tend to pay a little bit more than they would have done if they hadn't taken that year in industry. So it's a very positive thing that we offer, and as Manu was saying, we do have a very talented set of people here who can help you to find first a placement, and then at the end of your degree to find career opportunities. So there are structural things that we have in place at Brunel that can help you achieve those goals. But it does come back to what Stuart was saying about us not telling you what to think. It can be the case that students come in with a particular set of political beliefs. It's not our job to change that, but it is our job to challenge them, because we want you, if you have a particular political belief, well, we want you to be able to demonstrate it, what we call empirically. Show me the evidence. Persuade me. Demonstrate to me that your argument is actually correct. Because in politics, the ideas that we're dealing with, they are big ideas. And there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer to them. But there is a better researched answer. There is a better evidenced answer. And today, we're in a position where the type of evidence that we're able to provide is different than the way it was in the past. And that's why politics is taught differently at the good universities now that it's done as a BSc, because the evidence that we have through data are different to the way that any of us, when we were students, were doing it. The web happened, social media happened, information is available that was not available in the past, but also new information is being created all the time. By our interactions with social media, with various technologies, we can start using those data in a way that was never possible before, and we can communicate them in new ways that we couldn't have dreamed of 10 or 20 years ago. This has changed the way that politics is done, and it's changed what we know about politics, and this is very exciting to us. Now, across our 4-degree programs, if the type of politics that you're interested in is the Westminster type of politics, then it makes perfect sense to go straight for the BSc politics. If it's what we call the international relations, then that international politics BSc is the one to go for, because, as I said, it's international relations plus. It's doing the extra bit. It's including this thing that's called comparative politics, where we compare states, and that can be 2 states, 20 states, 193 states. But we're not directly doing it because we're interested in those states, but because we're interested in a political theme, be that democracy, human rights, autocracy, those sorts of issues. Then if you're interested in your history as well as the politics, then obviously the politics and history is the one to go for. And finally, the sociology. If you've got a foot in both camps and you just can't pick, do I want to do sociology? Do I want to do politics? Well, we offer both. And the beauty of that one is that when you come towards the third year of the degree, you can choose to do either a dissertation in politics or a dissertation in sociology, and we'll allocate supervisors accordingly. Now, I lost control of my mouse there. I want to see if we've got any comments in the chat, and I'm not very good at using this Q&A thing. Can anyone else see if we've got any Q&A coming in? Because I must admit I'm not too familiar with Zoom. I'm more familiar with Teams. Stuart, Manu, Naveen, are you able to see if there's anything coming through there?
There's nothing in the Q&A.
Oh, right. Super. Naveen, Stuart, do you want to chip in with any comments on how we do things at Brunel?
Actually have a question again for the students, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead.
If there was something that you could tell incoming first year, something that you could tell yourself back then that you wish you'd known, what would it be?
I would tell like first year students just to use first year as a way to like get used to uni and just settle into like the things that are expected of you, because like it's kind of like I do power mentoring, and a lot of the first year students, like they say how they feel stressed on like assignments and stuff, but that's just like you should really view first year as an opportunity to really like see what's expected of you and learn from mistakes. Like it's the best time to make mistakes, so don't be afraid.
That's a really good point. One of the things that I'll throw in, oh, go ahead, Jessica, please.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I would say the same, and I would also say like take every opportunity you can, like even if you feel like you're quite a shy person, like try and go out of your way to like make friends, speak to your lecturers and stuff like that. Like the help is available, and sometimes you feel like it's not, but it's just like sending a small email, you don't know how far it can go. So I would just say like try and push it, like get yourself out there a bit.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And it kind of touches on one of the things that I wish I could impress on students, but you know, university relationships with your lecturers are quite different than, you know, the relationships that you have with your tutors before that. And so I would definitely encourage all incoming students to take a minute and come chat to their lecturers. We're human. We're all right. We're easy to talk to. And we want nothing more than your success. So if I could impress on all first years who are coming into university to just take a couple of minutes and you know, if you don't understand something, don't be afraid to ask. And if you have an opinion, don't be afraid to express it. You're in politics. Politics is all about having opinions. So we definitely encourage that.
Yeah, I would first off, I agree with Naveen on the point about politics is about having opinions, and it's often more interesting when we get to disagree with people and have a good debate, or if you're that way inclined, a really good argument about something that you care about, and that's something that we encourage. And you shouldn't be intimidated by that. This is something that we'll tell you time and time again. I've got 2 dissertation students at the moment, both of them lining up to write a dissertation by the sounds of things that is critical of just about everything I've written for about the past 5 years about why young people are less likely to vote today. And I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I don't have a problem with it. This is interesting stuff, and you know, you will all have opinions about important issues, and you should come to university and use it as an opportunity to learn more about them, maybe revise them, but also to learn from other people. And if it means arguing with them, then all the better. It'll probably be more fun for you that way. I would also go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to mute myself. The point that Armin made about how intimidating it can be in the first year, and we know that, you know, despite appearances, it's not that long since I was an undergraduate student, and I remember how terrified I was when I went to university. And I work with Armin on the peer-assisted learning system that she mentioned. You'll have a personal tutor that will go with you throughout the entirety of your degree. Peer-assisted learning is a scheme that we run where second and third year students will give you help. There are dedicated sessions where they will basically go into a room and wait for you to tell them what it is you want help with. And it doesn't really matter what it is. If you are having trouble with managing money, if you're having trouble with figuring out how to use the library, if you don't know how to deal with assignments, they or your personal tutors can point you towards places that you can get the help. So university, it's supposed to be a bit intimidating because it's exciting, it's new, it's a fantastic thing that you're doing, and we really hope that you're going to come and do it with us. But you don't have to be worried that you're just going to be kind of pushed out into the wilderness and left alone. We are really good at providing support for students now, and you're going to get support from other students and from us as lecturers, not just in our role as your teachers, but also as your personal tutors right the way throughout your degree. So that really isn't something that you should worry about. There is plenty of support there to help you with this difficult but hopefully very exciting transition.
So I am still here, even though it looks like I'm not here. I've been in online sessions all day and my camera has just overheated and died, but I will carry on regardless. A question has come through on the on the chat regarding the availability of access to library and online resources and the like. It's really interesting because the way that we access our information is changing, and it was for historians, it's the case that when you're doing your research, you will be doing archival research, and that's been a bit of a problem during the pandemic in that most of the archives have closed down. They're opening up again now. With politics, it's a bit different in the way that we approach our research. There's several chief sources of it. Yes, you naturally start in the library for your books, for your theoretical sources, but in your research, and we make this clear from the very first stage in the first year, that what we call peer-reviewed journal articles are key. And some of you might not know what a peer-reviewed journal article is. It's what we call a double-blind peer-reviewed journal article. So there are journals the world over which deal with the cutting-edge research that's being done in lots of different fields, and for us it's political science. And the way that it works is that authors will send their research to the journal, and the editor will look at it and decide whether it's any good or not. If the editor thinks this research is terrible, then they'll throw it away. It's what we call a desk reject. They'll say, we're not publishing that, it's no good. But if the editor thinks, well, actually, there's something here, then they will tend to send it out to three people, three peer reviewers. And so those people will be selected as experts within the political science community. But the editor will not tell those three people the identity of the person who has submitted this article, and vice versa. The editor will not tell the person who submitted it who the three people are. That's why it's called double-blind peer review, because neither the reviewer nor the authors can see who wrote the thing. And then they'll go through a very long period of reviewing it. Ultimately, they may then reject it again. Or it may go to something what we call revise and resubmit, where it gets submitted back to the author, and then the authors have to refine this and go back to the reviewers and back and forth. This can take a couple of years to get anything published, but what this means is the quality of the work is far, far greater than anything, say, in a newspaper or something like that. Those are the sources that we want you to depend on for your theoretical arguments in your research. And some of those journals are becoming free now because there's this thing called the open access movement. But some of them are not. Some of them are very expensive. And this is where Brunel comes in to help, because all of those journals will be available to you at no cost, provided that you connect to the Brunel network. And you don't need to be physically at Brunel to do that. You just need to be logged into a Brunel account. Once you have that, you have access to a wealth of information that you don't have access to as when you're not part of the university community. Those articles are really, really important, and it's good to know that the lecturers who will be teaching you are committed to publishing in those articles and spend a lot of their time doing their cutting-edge research on that. So that's the peer-reviewed journal articles. But from a politics perspective, we need a third layer. So we've got the books, then we've got the peer-reviewed journal articles, but we have what we call our data. Now, data can take on many forms, and it becomes especially important to consider this when you're doing your dissertation. One form of data is through doing interviews, where you go out and you ask people questions. And there's different ways that you can do interviews, and we'll talk about this when we teach you the methodology of doing politics. But you can do a small number of interviews with experts, or you can do a large number of interviews, which will necessarily be shorter, with more generalists. Or you can send out surveys, and we'll teach you how to do surveys, what the methodology is behind surveys. What is a good survey design? How many questions to ask? Should I have a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10? Should I go with an even number or an odd number? Do I have a midpoint, a don't know category? And there's huge methodological research done on whether you should have a don't know category in surveys. Or another type of data that we have are those that come from what we call proxies, which is data that chiefly now that we can get through the internet. These may be satellite data, these may be social media data, they may be government data, they may come from non-governmental organizations, they may come from other universities. There's a whole wealth of sources of data, and the academics that we have in the department as experts in their fields will be able to point you to the appropriate data sets for your research. So that gives you the three bases on which we do like your dissertation. So first with the theoretical books, second with the more applied and more cutting edge research that's being done in the peer-reviewed journal articles, and third the data, which gives you your value added, where you are able to say, okay, I've mastered this literature, these first two layers. I know what's being said in the literature on my topic, but now I'm going to add my bit to it, and that's where my data come in. And maybe I can find something that's slightly different than what's being said already. So yeah, that's some comments on the availability of libraries and online platforms. Of course, there is something called Sconnell as well, whereby if there are books that we don't have in the Brunel library, well, there's lots of other libraries available to you, especially in London. And as a student at Brunel, you'll be eligible to get a Sconnell card, and you'll be able to go and visit those other libraries as well and consult those books. And some of our students will spend a lot of time in the British Library too, because there's a wealth of material there. But there's always other libraries that you can visit and access because of this thing called Sconnell. So there's lots of research opportunities and areas that we can look at. Okay, now we're coming up to a minute to the hour. So do any of our politics team have any final comments before we hand over to military and international history? Okay. Well, in that case, if I can press the appropriate buttons, and well, I'll thank my colleagues and I'll thank you for attending. I'm sure we hope that you will be with us in September, and we very much look forward to welcoming you. And now I will hand over to Professor Matthew Seligman, who will be taking care, along with Professor Matthew Hughes, of the military and international history session.
Right, thank you very much, Steve. That was fascinating. So just a brief introduction to how we're going to proceed. You may have heard this already if you've been to one of the previous sessions, but if you're just joining us now, what we aim to do is to provide sort of 3 snapshots of sort of representative topics that we cover, and also provide an opportunity to speak to one of our students to find out a bit more about the student experience. If at any point during this process you want to ask a question, then feel free to pop it into the Q&A. We might pick it up during the session, or we might wait till the end. It is possible to put those questions in anonymously if you want to. There's no need to give your name, but equally if you want to give your name, that's fine as well. And if you actually want to talk to us, it is possible for us to enable that to happen. So that's how some of the sort of tech side of this will work. As you've already heard, we offer a variety of different undergraduate programs at Brunel. There are various BSc degrees in politics in different sort of shapes and forms. History we currently offer in 2 different variations. One is the modern history degree, which is a broad program looking at history from various different angles across a sort of wide geographical spectrum, but being relatively confined in terms of its chronology. So focusing on the last sort of couple of hundred years broadly. What the military and international history degree does differently from that is to focus principally on matters of conflict. And it does that both through the prism of military affairs, but also through the prism of international affairs. But conflict is the unifying feature that gives sort of shape and form to the program. And across 3 years, we consider conflict conceptually. We have particular examples of conflict. We consider conflict in terms of broad themes like, war and geography. Conflict can be looked at in terms of military history defined narrowly, so as in the army, but more broadly in terms of the Navy and Air Forces, but also in terms of the sinews of war, like, for example, war finance, how governments control home fronts during war. There are lots of different ways in which we bring conflict into the picture. It's a very sort of convivial degree to do. The people who've chosen it generally know that that is the area that speaks most to them, and as a result, you tend to be with like-minded people with a sort of common interest in the topic. So I think that is one of the sort of core features of the program. Everyone knows everyone else on this program, again, because of the sort of nature of it. You study in your own cohort quite a lot of the time. You do mix with other students for particular parts of the program, so other history students and politics and history students, but there'll be lots of times when you are together as a discrete group and you develop that dynamic as a group, which I think is so attractive about a degree like this. Okay, well, that's some of the broad points about the program. We'll be coming back to that later when the 3 historians here have had a chance to say something about the kinds of topics that interest them. And we have in Mai Jonsson a student who can tell you a bit more about the student experience, maybe elaborating on what I've said or bringing new things to it. So I'm going to introduce my colleagues and myself, I think in one go at the beginning rather than doing this at every time, because I think this allows me to say something about the breadth of what we actually do. So the first speaker will be Professor Matthew Hughes. Matthew is an expert on the politics and conflict in the Middle East. He's written books about the Middle East in the First World War. More recently, a very well-reviewed book about the British Mandate in Palestine and the methods of pacification that took place in there. He's actually got wide-ranging interests. He's written important articles about the Pacific War, for example, but a unifying theme, which I think is emerging at the moment, is pacification, insurgency, and counterinsurgency, an extraordinarily relevant topic in the day, in the world in which we currently live, and I think demonstrative of the relevance of our programme more broadly. Dr. Richard Hammond is an expert on the Second World War in the Mediterranean. He's done a lot of work on both the British, Italian and German sides of this, integrating them together so that you can see the war in a sort of holistic process. He's used this to understand the concept of total war much more thoroughly than it had been previously, bringing new insights, for example, into the role of shipping and anti-shipping in respect of what total war means. I myself am a historian of the Royal Navy, the Anglo-German antagonism, and the role of intelligence in conflict. It's been a bit of a journey. I actually started out as a historian of Imperial Germany and German colonial policy in Africa, but progressively shifted to broader issues of the relationship between Britain and Germany, particularly its deterioration and why we ended up in conflict with each other. And that kind of brought me seamlessly to the German Navy and the British Navy and the way they perceived each other. And again, because threat perception, understanding your enemy is a very big part of geopolitics today, I think this is important for not just understanding history in the past, but showing why this is relevant to today's world. If you understand how states view each other and how they understand threats, I think you go a long way to understanding the kinds of conflicts that we find facing the world at this moment. And conflicts erupt all the time. There have been thousands of years of conflict in human history, but only tens of years of peace where there is no conflict happening anywhere. So sadly, it is part of the human condition. Okay, well, that long monologue aside, I will pass straight to Matthew Hughes to outline some of his research and interests for you today. So I'm gonna turn off my camera, Matthew, and allow you to take over.
Thank you. If I'm hoping you can all hear me clearly, let me just share my screen. So I am trusting that you can all see my introductory slide. And I'm talking today, as Matthew said, on my research interest on insurgency and counterinsurgency, with particular emphasis on the British Army. And I'd start by saying that you come to study military history at Brunel University, you will of course look at regular conventional war. So you'll look at the British Army in the First World War, topics that you might have covered at school, like the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele in 1917. You'll look at the Second World War, not just the British Army, but very importantly, the German army in its way of war. So you look at conventional, regular operations. And this is a big part of what we look at in military history, the evolution of operational art, how armies have developed, the weapons they use, conscription, how they organize finance on the home front so these armies could fight effectively and fully for long periods of time after the French and Industrial Revolutions. Now, that regular, conventional side of war is matched by this, which is counterinsurgency or insurgency, because another strand of what you will look at here at Brunel University, and also the subject of my recent research, as Matthew Seligman said, is irregular war, is unconventional war. And you see here an image of British soldiers from the Parachute Regiment in Afghanistan. And you'll know from watching the news that a large part of what the British Army has been involved in over the last 200 years has not been regular conflict. In fact, before the First World War, the wars that the British fought, which were conventional wars, were far fewer than the ones that they fought across the British Empire, which we would call insurgency or counterinsurgency, small wars, irregular wars. So this is another strand to what you will be studying at Brunel University. And what I want to open up, and I've only got 10 or 15 minutes, so I'll just give you a little taster of what you will be looking at, is a case study from the 1960s from Borneo in Southeast Asia. It's now split between Indonesia and Malaysia, the subject of my current research, and I'm looking at the experience of British soldiers in the Borneo campaign in the 1960s. So I'm picking up on this idea of irregular, unconventional warfare. Having said that, I do also teach conventional and regular war, but that's part of a different module. So you'll be able to study both sides of the military equation. So picking up on the idea of insurgency, low-level irregular war, what is it that I want to look at? Well, it's an incredibly topical subject because before the end of the last vestiges of the British Empire in the late 1960s, the British Empire was the pivot for the British Army, and across the British Empire, the acquisition of territory, the conquering of other peoples, the exploitation, the establishment of the British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen, was done on the back of a series of small wars, irregular wars by the British Army. And of course, the imperial domains that the British conquered required pacification and control. Local communities rose up in revolt. They were in opposition to British control. So the British Army spent much of its time in this period conquering, holding and repressing this huge empire on which the sun never set because it spanned its way across the whole globe. So what I'm looking at in the 1960s is the end of a long story that goes back to the 18th century as the British Empire established itself, and then in the 19th century had this huge burst of imperial acquisition. So the British Empire is a history of violence. It's a history of control. It's a history of kinetic operations. It's a history of pretty brutal repression. And that is a theme that is very well illustrated in this massacre that some of you may have heard about. In India, the town of Amritsar, a British general called Dyer led his troops. They were actually Gurkha, Sikh and Pathan troops, but they were British led, and you can see them here on the right hand side of the picture. They have machine guns, they have rifles, and they fire upon a large gathering of unarmed Indian demonstrators in town, in a large walled complex. It's very, very hard for these demonstrators to escape. And as a result of the firing, hundreds and hundreds of demonstrators are wounded, many of them very severely, by these high-velocity rifles the British are using, and almost 400 die immediately as a result of this attack. So this is an illustration from 1919 of what irregular war by the British meant, this suppression of this crowd of demonstrators who were in opposition to British rule in India. So this is a story of brutality. And more recently, there have been some good books on Kenya, another part of the British Empire in East Africa, and two books here by David Anderson and Caroline Elkins cover the topic of the way that the British suppressed a revolt, so again, an irregular war in Kenya in the 1950s. It was known as Mau Mau. And these two books show how brutal the British were in their treatment of the rebels in Kenya and actually of the population as a whole. So what you have here is a story of violence, a story of military history in the British Empire, which doesn't cover the British Army in glory. And what I'm looking at in the 1960s is something slightly different, because what I see in the 1960s in another counterinsurgency on the island of Borneo is how the British interact with local people in a rather more positive way. And I'm curious about this because the story that's been told is a story of repression, it's a story of brutality, it's a story of torture. And yet here, in this counterinsurgency campaign at the end of the British Empire, British soldiers seem to behave in quite a positive way towards local communities. Now, I won't go into the detail about what's going on in the conflict, but essentially it's British troops being deployed to support a government that will become friendly. The Malaysian government's being created in 1962-63. At the end of the British Empire, the British control this territory of Malaya and northern Borneo. And on Borneo as a whole, there is an insurgency and a conflict between Indonesia to the south and Britain to the north, in the northern part of the island. and there's also an internal communist organisation, which the British call the CCO, the Clandestine Communist Organisation. So this is the setting for my research, and this is what some of the territory likes. I've interviewed a number of soldiers, and of course interviewing is an interesting history method of getting more information, looking at history from different perspectives. I've just come back from the Gurkha Museum. Large numbers of Gurkha troops from Nepal were employed in the British Army, and they comment on this very inhospitable terrain. Very, very hard for the troops to move across this terrain to fight the rebels, fight the Indonesians, and maintain control. And if you're interested in technology, the introduction in a large way of helicopters, which were introduced in the Second World War and were used in Korea and Malaya in the 1950s. But in the 1960s, they used in a really big way to move the troops around. So I'm not talking about technology, but that's another strand of what we look at over the course of our military history program. So here's the terrain. It's hilly, it's jungle, it's very, very difficult, very inhospitable. The story from the past would be that the British could well behave in a very repressive way towards the local peoples. And what I discover in looking at many soldiers' accounts is the attachment and cultural connection, the affinity between the local people, between the British soldiers and the Gurkha soldiers led by British officers and the local people. And the jungle and the terrain seem very exotic. The British talk about it's being a very exotic jungle posting. Actually, what we discover is that the people they encounter are not that alien to the British, for the British soldier. The lives they lead have all sorts of connections with the British. And this, I would argue, and I do argue, is a strong reason why the British behave the way they do, which is very positively towards the local people. So here you have some of the local communities, often called tribes, but I'd like to move away from that nomenclature. But the British label the different communities with names are Ibans, the Dayaks, the Murut, the Punans, and these are the people who live in the hilly jungle area near the border where the fighting happens. So for the British soldiers, and they comment on this, these people seem very different, they seem very exotic, they dress differently, their lives seem very different to the ones they'd encountered back at home in the 1950s. Some of these soldiers entered the army through national service, but actually it's not as different as you might think. And here's an image, a classic image of some British soldiers moving through the jungle, and they have in Borneo a policy of what's called Hearts and Minds. And the Hearts and Minds campaign is a political campaign. It's a campaign of support for local people. And the British, through this local support, managed to win over the local population. But more to the point, I'm interested in how the British soldiers saw the local people. And as a result of how they saw them, how they treated them. Now, what I discover is that the British see the Ibans and the Dayaks in a very friendly way. The Hearts and Minds policy works. I have not found any examples of any brutal massacres like Amritsar, or there were similar massacres in Malaya, a place called Batak and Pali. So this story of violence seems to be quite different in Borneo, and there seems to be a different approach of Hearts and Minds, of building connections with local communities. And the question that intrigued me is, well, why is this so? Why did the British soldiers behave in this way in Kenya and then in quite a different way in Borneo? So I've developed various themes, and in the last bit of the lecture, I've only got about another few minutes to talk. I'm up to 12 minutes, so I'll talk for about another 3 minutes or so. I just wanted to raise a few points about the local people and how their lives and their cultures, which might seem very alien for the British soldiers, were not as alien as you might think. And this comes across when you listen to soldiers' memories of the campaign. And many of these memories are stored at the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, another one of those fantastic local archives we have in London, which you can easily access from Brunel University. Well, the Ibans and the Dayaks, these hill tribes, these hill communities, had many characteristics that appeal to the British soldiers. Now, number one, they're warriors. If you look carefully here in the image of this Iban man, this Iban warrior, you can see that they were traditionally headhunters. And when they fought their opponents, they would cut off the heads. And there are accounts of the British fighting alongside the Iban, where the Iban cut off the heads of Indonesian soldiers. But this idea of headhunting really appeals to the British soldiers. What they feel is here is a community like their own, a warrior people, what you would say would be a martial race. And this draws the British soldiers in. These are men who've been trained to fight, and they're now living amongst a strange community for them, but one that has many strong cultural affinities. Warrior is number one. Number two is tattooing. And British soldiers get tattoos done locally in the Iban design, which they then obviously come home, and it's a souvenir. It's a memory of their time in Borneo between 1962 and 1966. The tattooing is done differently in Borneo, but the tradition of tattooing, originally within the Royal Navy, but also in the army, soldiers, gives the soldiers a strong connection to the Iban. They have the tattoos, they compare tattoos. Some Ibans get tattoos of helicopters, and British soldiers get Iban designed tattoos done in black soot ink with a needle. It's quite a sort of a primitive way of doing the tattoo compared to a modern way of a tattoo design and being inked on the body. And these tattoos are another connection with the British soldiers that bring them close to the local community and help boost this Hearts and Minds campaign. And then, of course, there's alcohol. British soldiers are often quite heavy drinkers. They are young men. And the Iban and the Dayak, but especially the Iban, brew a local rice wine. It's very strong, filthy stuff. One of the British officers described it to me as, he said he always brought his own flask of whiskey. The soldiers liked it. And the local people who lived in these longhouses would bring out this tuak, this rice wine, when the soldiers were passing through their longhouses. And they would party and get drunk. And over again, alcohol and this connection with drinking draws the British soldiers in a very positive way in their memories of the conflict towards the local people. And this is a more recent image. It gives you an idea here. And they still sell this tuak if you go to Borneo today. And also, there's dancing, there's partying. The Ibans are incredibly welcoming to the British soldiers. The women, some of whom are topless, which again is an exotic sort of an attraction for soldiers. Women are not hidden away. They see the women, they dance, and the dancing of the Ibans as a welcoming party for the soldiers is matched by many of the soldiers, English county regiments, but also Scottish regiments like the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders dancing in reply to the Iban dancing. So what happens is the Scottish soldiers see this dancing by the Ibans and they relate it to their own country dancing. They also compare music, and the Scottish regiments will have a piper walking up and down the veranda of the local longhouses to play the pipes to show the music of the Scottish regiments. In reply, the Ibans playing their instruments and showing what the musical style is in the local community. So there are plenty of other examples I could give, but I'll wrap it up at this point by saying that it may seem like an exotic posting to this jungle frontier in Borneo, but this far-flung area of the British Empire, which is soon to leave the British Empire, was actually not that alien, but it was very familiar, and so appearances can be deceptive. It's important to look during a regular war, not just at the kinetic side, the brutality or the violence, but also look at how the soldiers connected to local communities and the effect that that had on the way that they behaved. And at that point, I will stop sharing and I will pass you back to Matthew Seligman.
And what I'm going to talk about is social reform in the Royal Navy in the Churchill era. There are particular reasons why I want to talk about that. It's partly a question of relevance. What we're looking at here is about how big organizations treat marginal groups. But it's also, I think, important because there have been discussions recently about, Churchill's role in British national life. Discussions that I think have raised all kinds of interesting issues, but do tend to focus on a very particular part of Churchill's life around the Second World War. I don't think enough is remembered about his life earlier. So I want to focus on the ideas of reform, why this matters, how it can change our image of someone, and what it tells us more broadly, actually, about the Royal Navy. So I want to begin with a story. It's a story about Churchill. It comes from the period around 1911 to 1915, when Churchill held the government job of First Lord of the Admiralty, that is to say, the political head of the Royal Navy. And the story goes something like this, that Churchill wanted to put forward a reform measure in the Navy, and he encountered strong opposition from the Sea Lords, that is to say, the professional sailors who served on the Board of Admiralty, and they framed their opposition around the idea that what Churchill was proposing went against naval tradition. And as the story goes, Churchill responded immediately and thunderously with the quip, "Naval tradition, monstrous, nothing but rum, sodomy, prayers and the lash." Now, for many people, this is typical Churchill, a sort of instant piece of memorable witticism, but is it actually true? Did he actually say that? There has been quite a lot of controversy over that. Now, those who think he did say this, that this is a genuine quotation, and the editors of the Oxford Dictionary of Political Quotations are amongst these people, would point to the quality of the source we have for this particular story. So although there are various sources, the one they cite, the one they regard as most important, most reliable, most authentic, comes from the diary of a particularly useful member of the British establishment, someone who'd been a diplomat, but then went on to write biographies of important politicians and members of the royal family, and that was Harold Nicholson, who recorded in his diary a garden party at which he'd met Patrick Lee Fermer, who was traveller, writer, former member of the Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. He'd been responsible for organising the plot to kidnap the head of the German occupation army in Crete. So he'd led a very exotic and interesting life. And according to Nicholson, what Paddy Fermer said to everyone at this party was he told the story and he said he could absolutely vouch for its authenticity. So it seems like a very good source for this Churchill story. On the other hand, those who don't believe this story would point to Churchill's former private secretary, who had apparently asked Churchill about this quotation, and Churchill had apparently said to him, "No, I never said it, I wish I had." And that also sounds like, pretty good evidence to the contrary. So the question people have often asked is this quotation a genuine Churchill quotation? And is it possible to say whether it was a genuine one? And the answer really is no. We can't know for certain because both of these are reported quotations. We can no longer ask Harold Nicholson or Patrick Lee Fermer or Auntie Montague Brown about this. We can't get beyond the fact that they reported it. We can't get back to Churchill on this. So we don't really know. And that then, I suppose, poses the question, why does it matter? Those people who think it's a typical Churchillian quip will probably think it's true, and those who think it has a more detailed history somewhere else will think it isn't, and sort of so what? Well, the so what here is about the four topics. So the quotation talks about rum, sodomy, prayers, and the lash. And these four items, the spirit ration, the way in which the Navy dealt with homosexuality, the way in which the Navy operated a system for spiritual ministration, the systems of sort of discipline and punishment, These were, as it happens, all topics that were of considerable importance to the Royal Navy in the very years 1911 to 1915, when Churchill was in fact First Lord of the Admiralty. And what this tells us is perhaps less important about whether or not Churchill said this, although the fact that these were topics of significance means it's, I think, in my mind, more likely that he said this. What this tells us is something about the culture of the organization, Churchill's role as a reformer, and what was going on more broadly in British society in a particularly modernizing period of British national history. So I want to deal with these four topics individually as illustrations of the way in which a big organization can change itself to map more closely to the society of which it is part. So let's start with rum and the spirit ration more broadly. So in this period, rum was part of a sailor's daily ration. The rum ration's abolished in 1970, but in 1911 to 15, sailors would routinely get an eighth of a pint of 95.9 degree proof blended Demerara rum, served 1 part rum to 3 parts water, normally, although it varied by station, after dinner. That's a lot of alcohol to have very quickly. It's mixed with water so it won't keep, so you have to drink it at that particular moment. It's known as grog, or sometimes 3-water grog. And what officers in the Navy noticed, and this is not really surprising, is that first of all, efficiency declined after the grog ration, and discipline also tended to get worse after the grog ration. So on grounds of efficiency and discipline, the grog ration was a terrible idea, and reforming it, or preferably eliminating it, a very good idea. In addition to that, politically speaking, alcohol and the maintenance of people's access to alcohol was something that was part and parcel of the opposition party in this period. So the Liberal government was strongly associated with nonconformity and regulating alcohol, and the Tory party was strongly associated with the brewing interests and the maintenance of public houses. So for both political and grounds of efficiency, it would have been a very good idea to reform the rum ration, and Churchill was very keen to do it, notwithstanding that he liked to drink himself. And what he proposed was something relatively simple. Sailors who didn't take their rum ration could elect to take what was called the savings price of rum, which meant they got 9/12 of a penny for every time they didn't take their rum ration, which was not a lot of money, and it didn't induce many people to be temperate. So what Churchill proposed was increasing the savings price to 1 or 2 pennies per day when you didn't take it, in the hope that effectively you could provide a financial inducement to stay sober. And it was a very good idea, and all the research that was done suggested it would have worked, but the Treasury simply refused. They didn't want to spend the several £100,000 a year that it would have cost to keep sailors sober aboard ship. But the point here is not that it was unsuccessful, but that it was raised in the first place. Sobriety and efficiency were key parts of the government agenda and Churchill's agenda in this time. Moving on to the questions of homosexuality. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain at this time. It was illegal in civic society, and it was even more illegal in the armed forces, the Navy in particular having a strong opposition to it, believing that the all-male environment of a warship, homosexuality, they thought, would destroy the sort of close order camaraderie of the crew. It's not true, but that's what they thought. Most of the time, however, they didn't really give any thought to it at all, because they didn't believe there was a problem, as they would have seen it, of homosexuality aboard ship anyway. But in 1912, there was a spate of court-martials for various homosexual offences, and at the same time a moral panic about homosexuality in mainland Britain. And these coalesced to create an environment in which some kind of reform of homosexual disciplinary procedures could occur in the Navy. This was not progressive reform as we would understand it, but it was reform that was bringing society and the armed forces together. And what Churchill's Admiralty proposed was a sort of twofold assault on this particular discriminated against group. One was to use the medical system as a form of evidence gathering for prosecution. So if a sailor presented himself to the ship's medical officer with a venereal disease in a part of the body where it could not have been contracted by heterosexual sex, the medical officer would report them, and then the commanding officer for the ship would instigate a prosecution for an offence that only existed in the Royal Navy. It was an archaic offence that they were reviving, which was called uncleanness, or to give it its full title, uncleanness or other scandalous action in derogation of God's honour and corruption of good manners. And in a sense, the venereal disease would act as proof of the uncleanness. And this provided a mechanism for prosecuting homosexuality that had not previously existed. Moving on to prayers, Churchill was particularly interested actually in spiritual ministration in the Navy, partly because he didn't believe that the chaplains the Navy had were good enough, but more because there was a problem attracting sailors from around the country, because the Royal Navy, like the rest of the establishment, effectively had an established church. It was illegal for anyone other than a Church of England chaplain to conduct services aboard a warship. And that meant that Catholic or nonconformist sailors didn't have access to chaplains of their own religious denomination. Now, in peacetime, that perhaps didn't matter quite so much. And the Navy actually went to quite a lot of effort to provide, religious services for all denominations on shore. But in wartime, when you have a chance of dying in action aboard vessels, Catholic sailors in particular bitterly resented the absence of access to a Catholic priest who might conduct the last rites. And Churchill was involved in trying to create a process whereby this could be made legal at the outset of the war. And then finally, when it comes to discipline, and particularly corporal punishment, the lash, corporal punishment for sailors had actually been suspended in the Victorian era, but it still existed for boy sailors, that is to say those under the age of 18, who could be birched or caned in this period, and frequently were. And this was politically important because, again, the Liberal Party was aligned with the sort of more humanitarian sentiments of British national life, and they were strongly campaigning against this. And one of Churchill's early acts as First Lord was to set up a committee on naval discipline that will report on this and other matters of discipline. Now, inconveniently for Churchill, they were actually all in favour of keeping corporal punishment, whereas Churchill, for political reasons, wanted to limit it, which is indeed what he did. He found mechanisms for, trying to address what he perceived as the need for it, whilst making sure that it was not actually something that was abused. So what you can see is that across this period, the ideas encapsulated in this quotation, rum, sodomy, prayers and the lash, were actually significant parts of the dialogue about how to reform the Royal Navy, a big institution, and make it more harmoniously aligned to the social norms of this period. And this is important for our understanding of Churchill, because Churchill's often remembered as a very conservative figure in the Second World War, whereas in this period he was a very radical figure. He'd been involved with Lloyd George in setting up the social security state that was going to, morph later on into the welfare state. But we have this image, and it's been perpetuated in the historiography, that when Churchill moved from being a very reformist president of the Board of Trade and a reformist Home Secretary to become First Lord of the Admiralty, out went the radical, and in came the, future soldier and warrior and war leader. And what this demonstrates actually is that this is not true. Churchill, admittedly for all kinds of, ulterior reasons, wanted to reform the Navy. He wanted to make it efficient in with a future conflict with Germany coming up. But part of that efficiency was that it had to align with the society it was protecting. It was no good if the Navy was a cast apart that couldn't identify with the broader nation. And in reforms designed to end alcoholism in the Navy, to bring the Navy's view of homosexuality in line with the nation's view, we're trying to bring more religious pluralism into the Navy, and making it more humanitarian in its systems of punishment. He was sometimes progressive, he was sometimes regressive, but he was always a reformist First Lord. And this tells us something about Churchill, it tells us about the Navy, and it tells us about big institutions in Britain more generally. And on that note, I will bring this to an end, and hopefully Richard's setup will be functioning better at this point, and I will have another go at passing straight to you. So Richard Hammond, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Not quite sure exactly what happened there. If I just share screen for you now, so hopefully you can see this. So as I mentioned before, long interest in the Second World War and in Mediterranean history, and I wrote a book, cover on the left there, that deals with both of these things, and in particular, kind of linking on from Professor Hughes's presentation, where he had this map showing the shipping that holds together the British Empire. It's on this line, the importance of shipping in the war, particularly in the Mediterranean. It's very important in that regard. Two maps here, the one on the left, showing the route through the Mediterranean versus the so-called Cape route going all the way around the south of Africa. So for Britain as an imperial power, after the Suez Canal is dug in the late 19th century, and particularly after they engineer a situation where they have a degree of control over it, this becomes a fantastic opportunity for them, a fantastic asset. This through route through the Mediterranean, as you can see here, cuts about half the length of time and distance, roughly speaking, a bit less, to India, for instance, key imperial possession, as opposed to going all the way around the south of the Cape of Africa. And similarly for access to other imperial possessions, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, Burma, Malaya, or to the dominions of Australia and New Zealand. So it holds the empire together for sort of imperial defence, for military purposes, and also for trade, really important in that regard. The cutting of those transit times is extremely important, and in fact we've seen a very, very clear demonstration of that very recently with the infamous blockage of the Suez Canal by a container ship, accidental blockage by a container ship, the Evergreen, and even though it blocked trade through the Suez Canal only for a few days, the cost is projected to have been huge because of the time taken for all container ships to have to go around the south of the Cape of Africa. Well, this is something that they have to do during the Second World War, because in 1940, fascist Italy enters the war on the Axis side. And this map on the right shows you the wartime sort of Mediterranean, map of the wartime Mediterranean. And you see Italy there, right in the middle of the Mediterranean, jetting down into it, and being this site that's going to threaten the through route through the Mediterranean. And Mussolini's Italy has imperial ambitions for a broader kind of Mediterranean empire, which is going to threaten British positions in North Africa, at places like Egypt, and other parts of the Middle East like Iraq, and elsewhere, places like Malta as well. So really important to sort of British way of life in many ways in that sense, but also sort of Britain's position in the world, and becomes under threat from 1940 onwards. The reason I write about shipping is it holds the whole war in the Mediterranean together. Lots of the war in the Mediterranean sort of theatre is fought on land, and a lot of that is sort of famously known in Britain, talked about a lot, particularly in North Africa, desert rats, all this sort of stuff. But elsewhere as well, in the Balkans, in parts of the Middle East, later in Italy itself, in Greece, these kind of places. And to transport what they need, the Axis forces, to these different places, they have to go through the Mediterranean. So to get men, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, everything they need to North Africa for the Axis forces, they have to send it from Italy through these routes shown on this map on the left, or elsewhere for territories elsewhere, it has to go across the Adriatic to the Balkans, or across the Western Mediterranean for Sardinia, later Corsica, or this little cut-out map on the right, that the Aegean possessions, the islands there, will have to be supplied by sea. And they have to go across the Mediterranean. There's no other way. Whereas Britain can, of course, still rely on that old, longer route south of the Cape, because they control the two entrances to the Mediterranean. At the west, by the Straits of Gibraltar, and to the east, because Egypt is a kind of pseudo-colony of the British Empire, they control the Suez Canal and can effectively shut it at will. So this Axis shipping holds everything together for them, and the British and later other allies as well work over the course of the war to try and cut these routes, and actually, as I argue in the book, is extremely effective in terms of determining the overall war in the Mediterranean. They do this in a variety of ways. So the effectiveness of the anti-shipping campaign is influenced by a lot of different things. Times it works really well, sometimes it works less well. But overall, I would argue it's extremely effective. It matters more when they prioritise, the Allies prioritise the Mediterranean more compared to elsewhere. The prioritisation of specifically anti-shipping efforts is much more important when that's the case. That's much more effective in terms of running an effective campaign, whereas they focus on other things like trying to intervene in Greece or things like this tends to harm it. And this often gets impacted by serious internal debates, first of all amongst sort of British actors, and then more broadly within the Grand Alliance, lots of arguments with the Americans about how much the Mediterranean matters and this sort of stuff. But even for the British themselves, arguments between, say, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy about who should control air assets and how much they should work over the sea and this sorts of stuff. So when those arguments are most fierce, the campaign tends to work less well. When things are a bit more harmonious, as you might expect, things tend to go a bit better. It involves the availability of the right kind of stuff and it being sent there, and technological and tactical developments and all these kind of things. Important sort of developments in intelligence, whereas Axis counterintelligence efforts, when they're working, this makes it harder. And in general, Axis efforts to kind of counter the Allied efforts are very important as well. So you see a couple of pictures on the slide here, which just highlight some of the interesting things that happen in terms of methods and factors that should be considered important in terms of the war in the Mediterranean. So a couple of them, this guy on the top left here is a scientist, a physicist actually, called John Kendrew. He's later, much later in the 60s, actually, to win a Nobel Prize. But in the war, he works in what's known as operational research. So he's involved in scientifically looking at operations that take place and trying to determine ways alongside his team to make operations more effective in the future. And he focuses on shipping in the Mediterranean. He's already worked elsewhere, so he's got experience in the Atlantic and things like this, works there and tries to find ways to make things like air and sea attacks against shipping more effective, of which there are a lot, and they're very, very dangerous. So this image to the right of Kendrew is an image of a British submarine crew with what's known as the Jolly Roger, which is a flag that kind of depicts their successes. So the bars are sinking of ships, the daggers are kind of raids where they drop commandos, this kind of stuff. But the submarine campaign against shipping is extremely important over the course of the war, and racks up very high tonnage scores and denies a lot of this shipping and cargo to the Axis. Similarly, air power, extremely dangerous job to undertake, lots of losses to aircraft and air crews, doing things like dropping torpedoes at ships or bombing at very low heights, low enough where it's not uncommon for them to hit the mast of a ship and crash or something like this. But when it works, the effect is devastating to the Axis. And actually that picture on the bottom is a picture of Bizerte harbour in Tunisia, which is one of the main two Tunisian ports for the dropping off of supplies during the Tunisian campaign, the last part of the war in North Africa. And as you can see, there are sunk ships everywhere in the harbour. It becomes unusable because there's so much wrecked shipping within it. So it becomes quite an effective campaign. So much so in the book, I mean, there are lots of stats in the book about these kind of things. But I argue that the destruction of Axis shipping absolutely fundamental to the Allied victory in the theatre. As much as we talk about things like the Desert War and the importance of the Battle of El Alamein or the fighting in Italy, or all these sorts of things, it's actually really, I would argue, what takes place at sea that determines the final outcome. In two ways. One is that the sinking of shipping at sea, and particularly the cargoes that they carry, denying those, particularly to Axis forces in North Africa, means that at key times when they have to fight in key battles like El Alamein, or a lot of the time in Tunisia, they lack what they need to do so. They start to run out of vehicles, but particularly they start to run out of fuel, especially, and sometimes ammunition. And that's because the stuff they need is not getting across the Mediterranean because the ships are being sunk or forced to turn back or badly damaged and they have to turn back and these sorts of things. So that's the kind of the smaller conclusion that has those operational effects. But the bigger conclusion that I would argue is actually over the course of the war in the Mediterranean, really what happens is that the toll to Axis shipping racks up over time, to the point that even when they try and seize more shipping from elsewhere, like from the French or from the Greeks, they don't have enough to hold everything together. It doesn't matter whether or not they're winning or losing on land, they can't hold things together. So key positions in North Africa, in islands like Sardinia or Corsica or in the Aegean, elsewhere in the Middle East, things like this, they can't get enough across in the first place, even if they aren't attacked, because they've lost so much by this point in time. And the losses are very, very big. So if you look at some of these tables, in terms of the quantities of stuff that are lost, this table on the left, table 4.3, about losses to cargoes in late 1941. Look at those numbers for, say, November. 92% of the fuel that is sent, it never arrives because the ships are sunk at sea or they're forced to turn back. So it has a huge effect when you're reliant on things like tanks and trucks and vehicles and these sorts of things, which you are in the desert, you can't survive without them. But also the quantities of shipping sunk means they can't sustain these positions and they have to withdraw from various places. So look particularly at table 7.1 and the losses to shipping in December 42 through to May 43, which is the time when they're fighting in Tunisia. The totals are huge, always more than 50 ships sunk a month. In the case of May, nearly 120, and the tonnage totals often over 100,000 tons, sort of getting towards something similar to the famous Battle of the Atlantic, where the roles are reversed and it's Britain that is on the defensive. So these losses are huge and the repercussions are huge. So there's one quite a long quote, but a quote just on the slide for you here. It's by a German official called Karl Kaufmann. He's the guy on the left of the pictures at the bottom, but where he talks about the prevailing losses in shipping, especially in the Mediterranean, causing him great anxiety, and ultimately the losses have increased, meaning that ultimately if they were to continue, it will no longer be possible to provide the shipping space, let alone getting them across, for supplies to Africa. So that's Karl Kaufmann down on the bottom. He's a sort of a German official who's in charge of shipping. The guy to his right, who says around the same time very similar things, is Giovanni Host Venturi, who's the Italian Minister for Communications and in many ways Kaufmann's Italian equivalent. I've ordered the pictures that way where they're facing away from each other because as the war goes on, particularly by the time we get to late 42 onwards, Germany and Italy might be allies, but they do not get on. They do not get on at all. They're very suspicious of each other in many ways. And it doesn't help that the war is going very badly for them. And in the case of the Mediterranean, the main reason is this loss of shipping. And the results are disastrous. An Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, where hundreds of thousands are forced to surrender because they don't have the supplies to continue fighting. They're trapped in the very north of Tunisia and there's not enough shipping to evacuate them. The withdrawal from Sicily in August 1943, very quickly followed by the Italian armistice and then dropping out of the war. The enforced withdrawal from Corsica and Sardinia, where there had been important air bases and these sorts of things, happens in October 1943 because they can't get the supplies to continue running the bases there, and they've become operationally useless, so they just withdraw. And finally, withdrawal from the Aegean as well in October 1944. And I would argue the main reason for all of these things is that attrition to shipping, something that holds the war together in a way in the Mediterranean that hasn't really been properly assessed before. So that's part of my research interest, and it links into more broadly my interests in Mediterranean history. And one of the modules I teach at Brunel, third year undergraduate module, looks at Britain's interaction with the Mediterranean from the early 18th century, where they acquired Gibraltar in 1704, right the way through to the infamous Suez Crisis in 1956, which is termed by some, maybe not too accurately, it's a subject to debate, but as one of the greatest calamities of British foreign policy. So that's it from me, but a bit of an insight into what I do and how it links into what I teach as well.
Right, we've only got a few more minutes left, so Matthew, over to you.
Oh, great to hear both of my colleagues talk on their research areas. So thanks to Richard and thanks to Matthew. But perhaps the star of the show and the most important person to speak to is a student, to find out what she thinks about life here at Brunel and what the military history programme has to offer. And on cue, I have one of my students here, Mai Jonsson, my personal tutee. So Mai, if you want to talk a little bit about what the highs and the lows, more highs than lows, I hope, of the programme. So over to you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. I have to say that coming to Brunel and studying military history here has been a delight, and it's been much, much better than I thought it was going to be. The lecturers are all amazing, very busy people, but they always take time out of their schedule to help out and support the students. And in the beginning, I have to say it was very intimidating, because it's people who have PhDs and are really smart and all of that. So I felt a little bit silly going to ask them for help about the smallest details, but once you do, it's really not scary. That's something I would encourage anyone to do when they need help, to go and ask and not be afraid to do so. You're muted, Matthew.
I'm unmuted now. So Mai, what have you're in the end of your second year now. What have you studied over the last 2 years that are perhaps new or have made you think differently about war in history?
When I first started, I didn't realise how big the topic actually was. I thought it was going to be very specialised and mainly revolve around conflict in itself. But once I came here and studied quite a bit, I realised that it's much bigger than that. It's about the economy, it's about the home front and how the entire home front has to be mobilised in time of war, especially during the last 200 years. So also found it very interesting to see it from more than just the military perspective, because it makes you realise how big, how complicated it can actually be in time of war, and it makes you realise that things don't always go to plan, just not because you're not too good at the battlefield, it's because of other things as well, such as ideology and organisation. And over the last 2 years, I've studied a whole lot of different things. I've studied how military thinking has evolved over the last few millennia up until recently. Also studied the world wars, which personally one of my favourites. Also studied intelligence. And another thing I think is really good that Brunel has done is the modules Historians and the Craft, and the first year module that I can't remember the name of that Matthew Seligman did with us.
Problems of the Past.
Was that one? I can't remember the name. But it really did prepare you for the dissertation and what comes after.
That's great. How did you find your fellow students, Mai? Did you like them?
Yeah, of course I liked them. Missed them a lot now during the online teaching though. Same thing with the lecturers, who I have to give a big shout out to, because they've really gone out of their way to make online teaching work. Don't have a single bad thing to say about the lecturers during the pandemic.
Oh, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Mai.
Fantastic to hear. Although I have to tell you, recording myself is one of the scariest and most horrible things I've ever had to do. Although there's one thing worse, is watching it back again to make sure it came out right, which is just ghastly. But there we go. We all have to suffer for our art. So thank you very much, Mai. Thank you very much, colleagues. And thank you very much for those who are attending. I think by accident or design, we have actually answered all the questions that have come up. So without further ado, I'd like to say thank you for being here. We'd love to see you, in inverted commas, in September. But even if not, we wish you well. And Inga, do you want to wrap up, or?
I'm just unmuting myself there just to thank all the attendees, thank everybody for coming along, thank the students for their contributions, thank colleagues for their contributions. Absolutely fascinating presentations we've heard about research and about the very wide range of teaching in all of our programs today. I'm really blown away actually by everything I've heard this afternoon, this evening. So thank you to everybody. And just to say, if anybody has any additional questions, they can by all means email us, get in touch with us. You will find us on the Politics and History Brunel webpage, but you can also, you see our names there, you can also Google us, and that will also come up with our web pages and our email address. So we really do look forward to welcoming you in September, October, and thank you ever so much for your time today and your participation as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.